Their forces are here. We must move now. But sir, our flank is exposed. What do you see?
In the winter of 1864, an army set out from the burning ruins of Atlanta and marched straight through the heart of the South. For nearly 1,000 miles, the war itself would move with it. Railroads would twist into iron knots, cities would burn, capitals would fall, and the flames that began in Georgia would eventually consume the streets of Columbia, South Carolina. By the time the march ended, the Confederacy would stand on the edge of collapse. This was not a single battle. It was a moving storm. A campaign unlike anything the American continent had ever seen. By the autumn of 1864, the Civil War had already entered its fourth brutal year. Across the United States, entire generations had been drawn into the conflict. From the blood-soaked fields of Antietam to the stone walls of Gettysburg, the war had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. In the South, the Confederacy still fought fiercely. Its armies remained in the field. Its leaders still believed the war could be won through endurance, but the strain on the southern states had grown severe. Railroads had been worn down by years of military transport. Factories struggled to produce weapons and ammunition. Farms across the countryside operated with fewer workers as men continued serving in the army. Yet the Confederate war effort still held together. The key to sustaining that effort lay in the network of railroads, supply depots, and agricultural regions that fed the armies of the South. One of the most important centers in that network stood in northern Georgia, Atlanta. Throughout the summer of 1864, Union forces under Major General William Tecumseh Sherman fought their way south through Georgia. Confederate troops under General Joseph E. Johnston attempted to delay the advance through a series of defensive positions across mountains, rivers, and ridges. Battles erupted across the northern half of the state: Resaca, New Hope Church, Kennesaw Mountain. Each time Sherman maneuvered around Johnston's defenses, forcing the Confederate Army to retreat closer to Atlanta. In July, Confederate President Jefferson Davis replaced Johnston with the aggressive General John Bell Hood. Hood launched fierce attacks outside the city: Peachtree Creek, the Battle of Atlanta, Ezra Church. But the Union Army held its ground. By early September 1864, Sherman cut the railroads supplying the city. Atlanta fell. For the Union, the victory transformed the war. For the Confederacy, it opened a dangerous new possibility. An enormous Union army now stood deep within the interior of Georgia. What it would do next would reshape the war. Instead of chasing Confederate armies across the countryside, Sherman proposed something unprecedented. He would march his army across Georgia to the Atlantic Ocean. He would cut loose from supply lines. His soldiers would live off the land. Railroads would be destroyed, depots burned, infrastructure dismantled. The goal was not simply to defeat Confederate armies. It was to destroy the system that allowed those armies to exist. General Ulysses S. Grant approved the plan. And on November 15, 1864, the campaign began. Atlanta burned. Railroads twisted into useless iron spirals. And from the smoking city, 60,000 Union soldiers marched east. The army spread across Georgia like an advancing front. Two massive wings of infantry moved along separate roads across the countryside. Cavalry rode ahead, probing the terrain. Foraging parties gathered supplies from farms and plantations along the route. Towns that had rarely seen war suddenly watched columns of blue uniforms passing through their streets. Covington, Madison, Milledgeville, Sandersville, Louisville. Railroads were dismantled mile after mile. Iron rails were heated in fires and twisted into grotesque shapes. Telegraph lines fell. Bridges burned. Across the countryside, the infrastructure that had sustained the Confederate war effort began to collapse. Within weeks, the Union Army reached the Atlantic coast. Savannah fell in December of 1864, but the campaign was not finished. Instead of stopping at the sea, Sherman turned his army north again. The next objective lay in the state where the Civil War itself had begun: South Carolina. In January of 1865, the army left Savannah and moved into the flooded low country of the Carolinas. Winter rains turned roads into mud. Rivers overflowed their banks. Yet the columns advanced steadily. Railroads were destroyed across the state. Towns such as Branchville, Orangeburg, Winnsboro, and Camden watched the army pass. Then, in February 1865, Sherman's forces reached the capital of South Carolina, Columbia. That night, flames spread across the city. Blocks of buildings burned. Smoke rose over the capital of the state that had led the movement towards secession 4 years earlier. The war had returned to its point of origin. After leaving Columbia, Sherman's army marched north into North Carolina. There, Confederate forces gathered for one final attempt to stop the advance. At Bentonville, Southern troops launched their last major attack of the campaign. But the Confederate armies were exhausted and outnumbered. Within weeks, the war itself would end. From Atlanta to Savannah, from the fires of Columbia to the fields of North Carolina, Sherman's march had carved a path through the heart of the Confederacy, and it had helped bring the Civil War to its final, inevitable conclusion. But how did an army of 60,000 men march nearly 1,000 miles through the South, destroying railroads, cities, and supply lines along the way, while Confederate forces struggled to stop it? What happened in the towns along that road? What did the people who watched the march remember? And how did this campaign change the final months of the Civil War? To understand the answers, the story must begin where the march itself began, in the burning ruins of Atlanta, November 1864. Act 1. The Road to Atlanta. Political and military situation leading to the march. Chapter 1. A war entering its fourth year. By the spring of 1864, the American Civil War had already consumed 3 terrible years of bloodshed. Across the South, entire communities had watched their young men march away to war. Many would never return. The Confederacy remained defiant, but its resources were thinning. Railroads were worn down by constant military use. Factories struggled to supply armies. Farms across the southern states were strained by the absence of labor and the constant demands of war. In Washington City, the Union government faced a different kind of crisis. Northern casualties had mounted into the hundreds of thousands. The war seemed endless. Public support for the conflict was wavering. President Abraham Lincoln faced re-election in the autumn of 1864. His political survival depended upon convincing the Northern public that the Union armies were finally moving toward victory. It was in this atmosphere that a new strategic partnership emerged between 2 Union commanders whose decisions would reshape the course of the war. Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant had recently been placed in command of all Union armies. Grant believed that the Confederacy could only be defeated through relentless pressure on every front. One of his most trusted commanders was Major General William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman had already proven himself in campaigns across the Western theater. Together, Grant and Sherman would now pursue a strategy designed not merely to defeat Confederate armies, but to break the South's ability to sustain the war itself. Chapter 2. Georgia becomes the center of the war. Georgia in 1864 was one of the most vital regions of the Confederacy. Railroads running through Atlanta connected the Deep South with the armies fighting in Tennessee and Virginia. Factories in the city produced weapons, ammunition, and military equipment. The surrounding countryside supplied food, livestock, and forage. If Atlanta could be captured, the Confederacy would lose one of its most important logistical centers. Sherman's army advanced into Georgia in May of 1864. Opposing him stood the Confederate Army of Tennessee under General Joseph E. Johnston. Johnston understood that his army could not afford catastrophic losses. Rather than fighting large pitched battles, he relied on defensive positions and gradual withdrawals. Throughout the early summer of 1864, Sherman maneuvered against Johnston along a series of ridges, rivers, and fortified positions across northern Georgia. Battles and maneuvers unfolded across locations that soon became familiar to both armies: Rocky Face Ridge, Resaca, Cassville, New Hope Church, Kennesaw Mountain. Each time Sherman attempted to flank Johnston's army, forcing the Confederates to retreat further south toward Atlanta. For the citizens of Georgia, the steady approach of the Union Army brought growing fear. Chapter 3. The command change. By July 1864, Confederate President Jefferson Davis had grown frustrated with Johnston's cautious strategy. Although Johnston's army remained largely intact, Davis believed that the general's continual retreats were surrendering too much territory without decisive resistance. In July, Davis made a controversial decision. Joseph E. Johnston was removed from command. His replacement was General John Bell Hood. Hood was known for aggressive battlefield tactics. During previous campaigns, he had been severely wounded, losing the use of one arm and one leg. Where Johnston had been cautious, Hood favored bold attacks. Within days of taking command, Hood launched a series of assaults against Sherman's forces outside Atlanta. The battles that followed were among the bloodiest of the Atlanta campaign. Peachtree Creek, July 20th, 1864. Battle of Atlanta, July 22nd, 1864. Ezra Church, July 28, 1864. Each attack resulted in heavy Confederate losses. Despite Hood's aggressive strategy, Sherman's army continued tightening its grip around the city. Chapter 4. The Fall of Atlanta. By late August 1864, Sherman shifted strategy once more. Rather than directly assaulting the city, he targeted Atlanta's remaining railroad lifelines. Union forces moved south toward Jonesboro, striking the last operational rail connection supplying the Confederate Army. The result was decisive. On September 1st, Confederate forces evacuated Atlanta. The following day, Union troops entered the city. The fall of Atlanta sent shockwaves across the Confederacy. For the North, the victory transformed public opinion. Lincoln's re-election prospects improved dramatically. For the South, the loss of Atlanta signaled something far more troubling. Sherman's army now stood deep within the interior of Georgia, and the next step in his strategy would prove unlike anything the war had yet witnessed. Act 2. The Decision to March. Chapter 5. The Political Situation in 1864. By the autumn of 1864, the Civil War had entered its fourth year, and the struggle had become as much political as it was military. Across the northern states, exhaustion with the conflict was spreading. Casualty lists had grown longer with every campaign. The great battles of the war, Shiloh, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, and the brutal fighting in Virginia during the summer of 1864, had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. Families in towns and cities throughout the Union had begun to question how much longer the war could continue. President Abraham Lincoln faced a difficult political landscape. A national election approached in November of 1864, and many believed his chances of re-election were uncertain. Opposition politicians argued that the war had become too costly and too prolonged. Some advocated negotiations with the Confederacy rather than continued fighting. In Washington, Union leaders understood that military success could shape public opinion. Victories on the battlefield could restore confidence in the government and strengthen support for continuing the war. The fall of Atlanta in September of 1864 proved to be one of those turning points. For the North, the capture of the city was a powerful symbol that Union armies were advancing deep into Confederate territory. Newspapers celebrated the victory. Political momentum shifted almost immediately. But in the South, the reaction was very different. Atlanta had been one of the Confederacy's most important industrial and transportation centers. Railroads from across the Deep South converged there. Factories in the city produced military equipment, ammunition, and supplies. Its warehouses held food and materials essential to Confederate armies. When the city fell, many across Georgia feared that the war had entered a new and more dangerous phase. Union forces now stood deep within the interior of the state. What those forces would do next remained uncertain. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman had spent months maneuvering his army across northern Georgia. Through a series of flanking movements and relentless pressure, he had forced the Confederate Army of Tennessee southward toward Atlanta. The campaign had demonstrated Sherman's approach to warfare. Rather than seeking a single decisive battle, he preferred maneuver and constant pressure, forcing Confederate commanders to abandon positions again and again. But after Atlanta fell, Sherman began considering a far more radical idea. Instead of pursuing Confederate forces further south, he proposed something unprecedented in American warfare. He He would march his army across the entire state of Georgia to the Atlantic coast. The plan called for abandoning the traditional military supply system that armies had relied upon throughout the war. Normally, an army depended on railroads and supply wagons to deliver food, ammunition, and equipment from distant depots. Sherman intended to sever those lines completely. His army would move across the countryside, living off the land. Soldiers would gather food, livestock, and supplies from farms and plantations along the route of march. Sherman believed that such a campaign would strike directly at the Confederacy's ability to wage war. Georgia was rich in agricultural production. Its farms produced corn, wheat, livestock, and cotton. Railroads running through the state carried supplies to Confederate armies operating across the South. By destroying those resources and transportation networks, Sherman hoped to weaken the Confederate war effort on a scale far beyond a single battlefield. He also believed the campaign would have psychological effects. If Union armies could march freely across the Confederate interior, destroying railroads and supplies along the way, it would demonstrate that the Confederate government could no longer defend its own territory. The war would no longer be confined to distant battlefields. It would be brought directly into the heart of the South. Sherman's proposal was bold, but it required approval from his superior officer. Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant had been placed in command of all Union armies earlier in 1864. From his headquarters in Virginia, Grant directed operations across multiple theaters of the war. Grant's strategy was based on simultaneous pressure. Union armies in Virginia would engage General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. At the same time, forces in Tennessee and Georgia would attack Confederate armies in the Western Theater. Grant understood that the Confederacy could not easily replace its losses in men or material. If Union forces continued pressing from every direction, Southern armies would gradually weaken. Sherman's proposed march fit within that broader strategy. Rather than pursuing Confederate forces endlessly across the countryside, Sherman would move directly through the Confederate interior, destroying railroads, supplies, and infrastructure. Grant approved the plan. The decision set in motion one of the most famous campaigns of the Civil War. Once the plan was approved, Sherman began organizing his army for the march. Approximately 60,000 Union soldiers remained under his command in and around Atlanta. These forces were reorganized into two major wings. The right wing was placed under Major General Oliver O. Howard. The left wing was commanded by Major General Henry W. Slocum. Each wing contained several corps of infantry supported by artillery units. In addition, a large cavalry force under Brigadier General Judson Kilpatrick would operate ahead of the main columns, scouting roads, screening movements, and disrupting Confederate attempts to concentrate forces. Sherman intended to advance along a broad front across Georgia. Rather than marching in a single column, his army would spread across multiple parallel roads, covering a path often 60 miles wide. This approach would allow the army to gather supplies from a wider area of countryside, while making it difficult for Confederate forces to predict the army's exact destination. Before the march began, Sherman ordered the destruction of Atlanta's military infrastructure. Railroads were torn up. Depots and factories were dismantled or burned. Large quantities of military supplies that could not be transported were destroyed. The city that had served as a major Confederate logistical center was systematically rendered unusable for further military operations. Sherman issued detailed orders governing how his army would sustain itself during the campaign. Soldiers were instructed to gather food from farms and plantations along the route of march. These foraging parties became a regular feature of the campaign. Groups of soldiers would leave the main columns to collect livestock, corn, sweet potatoes, poultry, and other provisions from the surrounding countryside. The practice was intended to reduce the need for long supply lines stretching back to Tennessee. But the gathering of supplies also carried destructive consequences. Railroads across Georgia became major targets of the campaign. Union engineers and soldiers tore up sections of track, heated the iron rails in large fires, and twisted them around trees or posts. The warped metal could not easily be repaired. These twisted rails soon became known as Sherman's neckties. Bridges were burned. Railroad depots were destroyed. Telegraph lines were cut. Every effort was made to disrupt transportation networks that the Confederacy depended upon. The campaign would not be fought solely against opposing armies. It would be fought against the infrastructure that supported them. On November 15, 1864, Sherman's campaign began. Before leaving the city, Union forces set fire to large sections of Atlanta's remaining military facilities. Warehouses, railroad yards, and supply depots burned throughout the day. Columns of smoke rose above the city and drifted across the countryside. Many civilians had already fled Atlanta after its capture 2 months earlier. Others now watched as flames consumed the remaining structures tied to the Confederate war effort. That same day, the Union Army began marching eastward. Thousands of soldiers moved out of the city along several roads leading toward the interior of Georgia. Infantry columns stretched for miles. Artillery batteries followed with long lines of wagons. Cavalry units rode ahead to scout the countryside. Behind them, the fires of Atlanta slowly faded into the distance. Ahead lay nearly 300 miles of countryside between the Army and the Atlantic coast. Sherman's forces were now moving into territory where no large Union army had previously marched. The campaign that followed would carry the war across the heart of Georgia, leaving behind a trail of destroyed railroads, emptied storehouses, and burned bridges. And as the columns advanced eastward through the red clay roads and pine forests of the state, communities across Georgia prepared for the arrival of an army that intended to carve its way to the sea. Chapter 11. The columns leave Atlanta. On the morning of November 15, 1864, the Union Army began its march out of Atlanta. For months, the city had stood as the focal point of the war in Georgia. Now the blue columns of Sherman's army moved eastward from the smoking ruins of its rail yards and depots. Approximately 60,000 Union soldiers advanced in several large columns along the roads leading into the countryside. Sherman's army was organized into two main wings. The right wing, under Major General Oliver O. Howard, moved along the southern routes east of Atlanta. The left wing, under Major General Henry W. Slocum, advanced along northern roads toward the Georgia interior. The army did not move in a single narrow column. Instead, it spread across a broad front, often 30 to 60 miles wide. This movement made it difficult for Confederate commanders to determine Sherman's true objective. Some believed he intended to strike toward Augusta. Others feared he might move south toward Macon. Still others suspected that Savannah on the coast was the true destination. For the people of Georgia, the first signs of the approaching army appeared on the roads leading away from Atlanta. Miles of infantry marched through the countryside. Wagons loaded with supplies creaked across wooden bridges. Artillery batteries rolled along the red clay roads. Wherever the columns passed, soldiers gathered food and livestock from nearby farms. The march had begun. On November 16th, the army pushed deeper into central Georgia. Union forces advanced along several key routes leading away from Atlanta. The left wing moved toward the towns of Decatur and Lithonia before continuing east toward Covington and Madison. The right wing marched through the countryside south of these routes, moving toward McDonough and other small communities scattered across the farmland. Kilpatrick's cavalry rode ahead of the infantry columns, scouting roads and probing for Confederate resistance. The landscape through which the army advanced was typical of central Georgia. Rolling farmland stretched across the countryside. Cotton fields and cornfields surrounded scattered plantations and small towns. Pine forests lined many of the roads. Streams and creeks crossed the path of the marching columns. Along these roads, the war now came directly to the civilian population. Foraging parties left the main columns daily. Small groups of soldiers entered farms and plantations gathering food for the army. Corn, livestock, poultry, and stored provisions were taken to sustain the advancing forces. Barns were emptied, smokehouses were cleared, livestock was driven away. The countryside that had supported Confederate armies for years now became the source of provisions for the Union Army marching across it. Chapter 13. Toward Covington and Madison. By November 17th, Sherman's army had spread widely across the region east of Atlanta. The left wing moved toward the towns of Covington and Madison along the roads that ran through Newton and Morgan counties. These towns had experienced little direct military activity during the earlier years of the war. Their quiet streets had remained far removed from the great battlefields of Virginia and Tennessee. Now the arrival of Sherman's army changed that reality. Union troops entered Covington and Madison, occupying the towns and gathering supplies from surrounding farms. Warehouses, cotton gins, and storehouses were inspected by Union officers searching for materials that could aid the Confederate war effort. Railroads remained a primary target of the campaign. Wherever tracks were encountered, Union engineers set to work tearing up the rails. Large fires were built along the railroad lines. The iron rails were heated until they glowed red. Soldiers then wrapped the softened rails around trees or fence posts, twisting them into warped shapes that could not easily be repaired. These twisted rails became known as Sherman's neckties. By destroying the railroad infrastructure of Georgia, Sherman aimed to cripple the transportation system that supported Confederate armies across the region. Chapter 14. The Battle of Griswoldville. Although Sherman's march encountered little organized resistance in its early days, one Confederate force attempted to halt the advance. On November 22, 1864, Confederate militia units gathered near the small town of Griswoldville, located southeast of Macon. These troops consisted largely of Georgia militia, older men and younger recruits who had been called into service to defend the state. Many lacked the combat experience of veteran soldiers who had fought in earlier campaigns. Union forces moving through the area included elements of the 15th Corps under Major General Peter J. Osterhaus. When the Confederate militia advanced toward Union positions near Griswoldville, they encountered well-positioned infantry supported by artillery. The result was a brief but costly battle. Confederate militia units charged across open ground toward the Union line. Union artillery and rifle fire cut down the advancing formations. The attack collapsed within a short time. Casualties among the Confederate militia were heavy. For Sherman's army, the battle confirmed that organized resistance along the route of march would likely be limited. The main Confederate field armies were far away. Only scattered militia units stood between the Union columns and the coast. Chapter 15. Milledgeville, capital of Georgia. By November 23, Sherman's army approached Milledgeville, the capital of the state of Georgia. Located along the Oconee River, Milledgeville had served as the political center of Georgia since the early 19th century. The state legislature had met there for decades, guiding the affairs of Georgia through peace and war. Now the war had reached its doorstep. Union forces entered the city with little resistance. Government officials had already fled. The State House stood quiet as Union soldiers occupied the town. Milledgeville held both political and symbolic importance. The capture of the state capital demonstrated how deeply Sherman's army had penetrated the Confederate interior. The army remained in the area briefly while its columns regrouped and prepared to continue the march. Meanwhile, destruction of railroads and military resources continued across the surrounding countryside. Tracks along the Georgia Central Railroad were torn up. Bridges were burned. Telegraph lines were cut. From Atlanta to Milledgeville, the march had already carved a wide path across central Georgia. Yet the campaign had only begun. Hundreds of miles of countryside still lay between Sherman's army and the Atlantic coast. Ahead stood the towns of Sandersville, Louisville, and Waynesboro. Beyond them lay the final objective of the campaign, Savannah. And as the Union Army prepared to move forward once again, The full scale of the march and the devastation it would leave across Georgia was only beginning to unfold. After occupying Milledgeville on November 23, 1864, Sherman's army resumed its march toward the Atlantic coast. The capture of Georgia's capital had demonstrated how deeply Union forces had penetrated the Confederate interior. Yet the campaign was far from complete. Between the army and the coast stretched more than 100 miles of countryside, threaded with railroads, plantations, and small towns. Sherman's two wings now moved steadily southeast. The left wing under General Henry Slocum advanced toward Sandersville and the upper crossings of the Ogeechee River. The right wing under General Oliver Howard moved along routes farther south, aiming toward the towns of Gordon, Tennille, and the rail connections feeding Augusta and Savannah. The broad front of the Union Army spread across large portions of central Georgia. Columns of infantry advanced along multiple country roads. Artillery batteries followed behind them. Long wagon trains moved slowly over the red clay terrain. Each day, the Army continued its systematic destruction of railroads. Tracks along the Georgia Central Railroad were torn apart. The iron rails were heated in great fires and twisted into useless spirals. Bridges were burned, telegraph wires were cut. For the people living along these rail lines, the destruction of transportation routes carried long-lasting consequences. Railroads had connected towns, farms, and markets across the state. Their loss meant the collapse of many supply routes that had sustained both the Confederate armies and civilian communities. As the Union Army pushed forward, the physical infrastructure of Georgia's interior began to unravel. By November 25th, Sherman's columns approached the town of Sandersville in Washington County. The region surrounding Sandersville was largely rural, dotted with farms, plantations, and small agricultural communities. Union troops entered the town with little organized resistance. Confederate forces in the region were limited mostly to small detachments of cavalry and local militia units. The main Confederate armies were far away, engaged in other theaters of the war. As Sherman's forces moved through Sandersville, they gathered supplies from the surrounding countryside. Livestock was seized, corn cribs were emptied, smokehouses containing cured meats were stripped of provisions. These actions were part of the broader system Sherman had ordered for sustaining his army. Foraging parties moved out daily from the main columns. Groups of soldiers searched farms and plantations for food that could sustain the advancing army. The practice became so widespread that these soldiers developed a reputation across Georgia. They came to be known as bummers. The name referred to their role in gathering provisions from the countryside. Their activities soon became one of the most remembered aspects of the march. Chapter 18: Railroads and the Destruction of Transportation. One of the central goals of Sherman's campaign was the destruction of Georgia's railroad network. Throughout late November, the Union Army focused much of its effort on dismantling the transportation routes that supported Confederate logistics. The Georgia Central Railroad became a major target. Sections of track were torn up across long stretches of countryside. Union soldiers heated rails in fires built from railroad ties. Once the metal softened, the rails were bent and twisted around trees. The resulting shapes rendered the iron useless. Repairing these lines would require enormous time and effort. Rail depots and supply warehouses were also destroyed. Bridges crossing rivers and creeks were burned. Telegraph poles were cut down. Each mile of railroad destroyed further isolated Confederate forces operating in the region. For communities across central Georgia, the loss of railroads meant a sudden break in transportation, communication, and commerce. The march had become not only a military campaign, but also a sweeping disruption of the state's infrastructure. Chapter 19. Louisville and the Path to the Coast. By the end of November, Sherman's forces moved through Jefferson County toward the town of Louisville. Louisville had once served as Georgia's state capital before the government moved to Milledgeville decades earlier. Now it stood along the path of Sherman's advancing army. Union columns passed through the area around November 29th and 30. Confederate cavalry attempted to slow the advance in scattered engagements along the roads leading south and east. Small skirmishes occurred as Confederate horsemen probed the edges of the Union columns. But these forces were too small to stop the march. The Union Army continued moving forward. Across the countryside, the impact of the campaign grew more visible. Farms that had supplied Confederate armies now found their livestock gone. Railroads that had connected towns were reduced to twisted rails. Storehouses containing cotton and provisions were burned. The countryside that Sherman's army passed through changed rapidly in the wake of the march. Chapter 20. Millen and the Confederate Prison Camp. One of the locations encountered by Sherman's army during the march was the town of Millen. Located along the railroad line connecting Augusta and Savannah, Millen had served as the site of Camp Lawton. This Confederate prison camp had been constructed earlier in 1864 to hold Union prisoners of war. By the time Sherman's army approached the area in late November, Confederate authorities had already evacuated the prisoners. The prison camp was largely abandoned. Union soldiers found the remains of the stockade and the structures that had once housed thousands of captured soldiers. The discovery of the camp illustrated another dimension of the war's impact across the South. Prisons, supply depots, and military installations had been scattered across the countryside during the years of conflict. Now many of them lay empty or destroyed as the Union Army advanced. As November turned into December, Sherman's columns continued their march toward the eastern counties of Georgia. The two wings of the army maintained their broad separation while moving steadily toward the coast. The left wing advanced through regions north of the Ogeechee River. The right wing moved along southern routes toward Waynesboro and the lower crossings of the Savannah River Basin. Confederate cavalry under General Joseph Wheeler attempted to shadow the Union Army during this phase of the campaign. Wheeler's horsemen carried out occasional raids against isolated Union units and supply wagons. Skirmishes occurred along rural roads and river crossings, but Wheeler lacked the numbers needed to halt the advance. Sherman's army continued moving forward. By early December 1864, the Union Army had marched more than 200 miles across Georgia. From Atlanta to the eastern counties of the state, the route of the campaign left visible marks across the countryside. Railroads were dismantled. Bridges lay in ruins. Livestock had been taken from farms along the army's path. Cotton gins and warehouses had been destroyed. The destruction was not uniform across every mile of the march, but its effects were widespread enough to reshape the region through which the army had passed. For many Southerners observing the campaign, the march symbolized a new form of warfare. Rather than focusing solely on opposing armies, the campaign targeted the economic resources that sustained the Confederate war effort. By the second week of December, Sherman's army approached the coastal lowlands of Georgia. Ahead lay the final objective of the campaign: Savannah. Between the army and the city stood the marshes, rivers, and defensive works protecting the coast. And there, Confederate forces prepared for the final phase of the campaign. Act 5. The Road to Savannah. December 10th. December 21st, 1864. Chapter 23. Approaching the coast. By the second week of December 1864, Sherman's army had crossed the interior of Georgia and was approaching the low coastal country that surrounded the city of Savannah. The terrain now began to change. The rolling farmland of central Georgia gradually gave way to a landscape shaped by tidal rivers, marshes, and dense forests. Roads became narrower and more difficult to navigate. Swamps and waterways limited the number of viable approaches toward the city. Savannah itself stood on a bluff above the Savannah River, protected by a network of fortifications, flooded rice fields, and defensive works built earlier in the war. Confederate forces under Lieutenant General William J. Hardee had been assigned to defend the city. Hardee commanded a force of roughly 10,000 Confederate soldiers. These troops consisted of infantry units withdrawn from other posts along the Atlantic coast, supported by artillery defending the river approaches. Although Hardee's army was smaller than Sherman's force, the natural geography surrounding Savannah offered significant defensive advantages. Marshes, rivers, and flooded rice plantations created obstacles that could slow an attacking army. But Sherman's objective was not necessarily to storm the city immediately. His first goal was to reconnect with the United States Navy operating along the Atlantic coast. Doing so would reopen supply lines for his army after weeks of marching across Georgia without external support. Between Sherman's army and the sea stood one critical obstacle: Fort McAllister. Fort McAllister guarded the southern approach to Savannah along the Ogeechee River. Constructed earlier in the war, the fort had already gained a reputation for resilience. Union naval vessels had previously attempted to destroy it during earlier operations along the Georgia coast. Despite repeated bombardment from Union warships, the earthwork fortifications had survived. Its thick walls of packed sand and earth absorbed cannon fire that would have shattered traditional stone fortifications. Now the fort stood directly in the path of Sherman's army as it advanced toward the coast. On December 13, 1864, Union forces under Major General William B. Hazen were ordered to assault the fort. Hazen's division advanced across open ground toward the Confederate defenses. The attacking infantry moved quickly across the fields leading to the fort, while Confederate artillery and rifle fire attempted to slow their advance. Despite the defensive fire, Union soldiers reached the outer works of the fort and began climbing the parapets. After a brief but intense fight, the Confederate defenders were overwhelmed. Fort McAllister fell into Union hands. The capture of the fort had immediate strategic consequences. It opened the Ogeechee River to Union control and allowed Sherman's army to establish direct contact with Union naval forces operating offshore. For the first time since leaving Atlanta nearly a month earlier, Sherman's army regained access to secure supply lines. The march across Georgia had reached the Atlantic. With Fort McAllister captured, Sherman turned his attention to Savannah itself. Union forces moved to surround the city from the west and south. Artillery batteries were positioned along the approaches to the city's defensive lines. Union engineers began constructing siege works while infantry units secured the surrounding countryside. Hardee's Confederate forces remained inside Savannah, occupying the defensive positions protecting the city. Although Sherman's army significantly outnumbered the defenders, the terrain around Savannah complicated any immediate assault. The flooded rice fields west of the city formed natural barriers. Narrow causeways and limited roads made large-scale attacks difficult. Rather than rushing into a costly assault, Sherman positioned his forces to isolate the city. Union troops controlled the land approaches. Union naval vessels operated along the nearby rivers and coastal waters. Savannah now stood largely cut off from outside support. Inside the city, Confederate commanders assessed their situation carefully. Hardee's army was outnumbered. Supplies were limited. The possibility of holding the city indefinitely appeared increasingly unlikely. During the night of December 20, 1864, Confederate forces began evacuating Savannah. Hardee had decided that preserving his army was more important than defending the city to destruction. Using a pontoon bridge constructed across the Savannah River, Confederate troops quietly withdrew toward South Carolina. Artillery, wagons, and infantry crossed the bridge during the night. By morning, the Confederate army had successfully escaped the city. The withdrawal allowed Hardee to avoid encirclement and preserved his forces for future operations. But Savannah itself had been abandoned. Union forces soon discovered that the defensive lines protecting the city were empty. The road to Savannah now lay open. On December 21, 1864, Union troops entered Savannah. The long march across Georgia had reached its final objective. For weeks, Sherman's army had advanced across the state, destroying railroads, seizing supplies, and demonstrating the reach of Union power within the Confederate interior. Now the campaign ended at the Atlantic coast. Savannah, one of the South's important port cities, had fallen into Union hands. The capture of the city provided Sherman with a secure base along the coast and restored full supply lines for his army. The campaign had lasted just over a month. In that time, Sherman's army had marched nearly 300 miles from Atlanta to the sea. Sherman soon reported the capture of Savannah to the Union government in Washington. The campaign had achieved its primary strategic goals. Georgia's railroad network had suffered widespread destruction. Agricultural resources that supported Confederate armies had been seized or destroyed. Union forces had demonstrated their ability to move freely through the Confederate interior. For many in the South, the march symbolized a new phase of the war. The conflict had reached beyond battlefields and into the countryside that sustained the Confederate war effort. Farms, railroads, and infrastructure had become targets of military operations. By the winter of 1864, the Confederacy faced mounting pressure on every front. Union armies were advancing in Virginia, Tennessee, and along the Mississippi. Sherman's march had added another severe blow to Southern resources and morale. Yet the war itself was not over. Sherman's army would soon leave Savannah and continue north into the Carolinas in the early months of 1865. But the march to the sea had already secured its place as one of the most significant campaigns of the Civil War. It had carried an army across the heart of Georgia, and it had changed the nature of the war in the South forever. Chapter 29. Leaving Savannah. The capture of Savannah in December 1864 marked the end of one campaign, but not the end of Sherman's march. The Union Army had crossed Georgia from Atlanta to the Atlantic coast in little more than a month. Railroads had been torn apart, supply depots destroyed. Confederate resources across the state had been severely weakened. But the war itself was still far from finished. General William Tecumseh Sherman now prepared for the next phase of his strategy. Instead of moving his army by sea to Virginia, he chose to march northward through the Carolinas. The decision carried powerful symbolic meaning. South Carolina held a special place in the origins of the Civil War. It was there, in Charleston Harbor, that the first shots of the conflict had been fired in April of 1861. It was South Carolina that had led the movement toward secession 4 years earlier. Now, in the winter of 1865, the war would return to the state where it had begun. On January 20th, 1865, Sherman's army began leaving Savannah. The columns moved north across the rice fields and marshlands surrounding the city. Ahead lay the rivers and low country of coastal South Carolina. Chapter 30. Into South Carolina. Crossing into South Carolina proved difficult. Winter rains had flooded large portions of the coastal plain. Rivers overflowed their banks. Roads disappeared into deep mud. Union engineers worked constantly to keep the army moving. Pontoon bridges were constructed across swollen rivers. Corduroy roads were built by laying logs across muddy ground so wagons and artillery could pass.
Wagons advance, keep the pace.
Despite the difficult terrain, the army advanced steadily. The right wing under General Oliver Howard moved inland toward Pocataligo and the railroad lines leading to Charleston. The left wing under General Henry Slocum advanced toward the towns of Hardeeville and Branchville. Sherman's objective was to disrupt the transportation networks linking Charleston, Augusta, and Columbia. The campaign quickly spread across the countryside. Union foraging parties moved through plantations and farms gathering food for the army. Railroads were dismantled wherever they were found. Bridges were burned. Telegraph lines fell. Across South Carolina, the war returned with new intensity. Chapter 31. The Destruction of the Low Country. Union columns pushed northward through towns and plantations scattered across the coastal plain. Places like Hardeeville, Pocataligo, and Yemassee saw Union troops passing through their streets. Railroads that once connected Charleston with the interior were torn apart. The Charleston and Savannah Railroad became one of the primary targets. Sections of track were uprooted. Iron rails were heated in fires and twisted around trees in the now familiar shapes known as Sherman's neckties. Depots along the line were burned. Locomotives were destroyed. With the railroads dismantled, Charleston became increasingly isolated from the interior of the state. Meanwhile, Confederate forces attempted to slow the advance. Small cavalry units under General Wade Hampton harassed the edges of the Union columns. Skirmishes broke out along muddy roads and river crossings. But the Confederate forces were too few to halt the massive army moving north. Chapter 32. Toward Branchville and Orangeburg. By early February 1865, Sherman's columns advanced deeper into South Carolina. The town of Branchville lay at a crucial railroad junction linking Charleston, Columbia, and Augusta. Union troops entered the town and immediately set about destroying the rail facilities. Tracks were torn up. Warehouses burned. The railroad junction that had served Confederate logistics for years was rendered useless. The army then moved toward Orangeburg along the railroad line connecting the interior of the state. Orangeburg fell to Union forces in early February. Much of the railroad infrastructure surrounding the town was destroyed. Railroad bridges over nearby rivers were burned. Cotton stored in warehouses was set on fire. As the campaign progressed northward, the destruction of transportation infrastructure spread across the central region of South Carolina. Chapter 33. The Road to Columbia. By mid-February, Sherman's army was approaching Columbia. The state capital lay along the Congaree River in the center of South Carolina. Confederate forces under General Wade Hampton and other commanders attempted to delay the Union advance. Skirmishes occurred along the approaches to the city. Confederate cavalry fought a brief engagement at the town of Aiken to slow Union movements in that region. Despite these efforts, Sherman's army continued closing in on Columbia. The Confederate government ordered the evacuation of military supplies from the city. Railroad bridges across the Congaree River were prepared for destruction. When Union forces approached the city on February 17th, Confederate troops withdrew across the river. The bridges were burned behind them. Columbia now stood exposed. Chapter 34. The Burning of Columbia. Union troops entered Columbia on February 17, 1865. During the evening and night that followed, fires spread across the city. The exact causes of the fires remain debated among historians. Bales of cotton had been placed in the streets before the Union arrival. Some were already burning. High winds carried sparks through the city. Other fires began in warehouses and supply depots. The strong wind that night pushed flames through blocks of wooden buildings. Entire sections of the city began to burn. Flames spread from building to building. Churches, homes, warehouses, and public structures were consumed by the fire. By morning, large portions of Columbia lay in ruins. The destruction left one of the most dramatic scenes of devastation witnessed during the Civil War. Smoke drifted above the city. Charred buildings collapsed into the streets. For many across South Carolina, the burning of Columbia symbolized the full arrival of the war into the state that had once been its birthplace. Chapter 35. Charleston abandoned. While Sherman's army moved through central South Carolina, events were unfolding along the coast. Charleston had endured years of Union naval blockade and bombardment. Union artillery positioned on nearby islands had fired upon the city for long periods of the war. With Sherman's army advancing through the interior and railroads destroyed across the state, Confederate commanders concluded that Charleston could no longer be held. On February 17, 1865, Confederate forces began evacuating the city. Explosions shook the harbor as military supplies were destroyed. The following day, Union troops entered Charleston. The city where the war had begun 4 years earlier was now under Union control. Chapter 36. Into North Carolina. After leaving Columbia, Sherman's army continued its march northward. Union forces advanced toward the North Carolina border through towns such as Winnsboro and Camden. Railroads across the region continued to be dismantled. The Charlotte and South Carolina Railroad was destroyed in multiple locations. Confederate cavalry continued to shadow the Union columns, but lacked the strength to halt their progress. By March 1865, Sherman's army crossed into North Carolina. The campaign now entered its final phase. Chapter 37. Bentonville. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston had been restored to command of Southern forces in the Carolinas. Johnston gathered what troops he could find in an effort to strike Sherman's army before it could unite its scattered columns. On March 19, 1865, Confederate forces attacked Union troops near Bentonville, North Carolina. The battle lasted several days. Confederate attacks initially pushed back portions of the Union line, but Sherman's larger army soon concentrated its forces. Union reinforcements arrived. The Confederate army withdrew. Bentonville became the last major battle of the Carolinas campaign. Chapter 38. The end of the campaign. By April 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing across multiple fronts. In Virginia, General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. In the Carolinas, Joseph E. Johnston faced overwhelming Union forces. Negotiations began between Sherman and Johnston. On April 26, 1865, Johnston surrendered his army near Durham Station, North Carolina. The surrender included Confederate forces across the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. Sherman's long march from Atlanta through Georgia and the Carolinas had come to an end. In the spring of 1865, the marching stopped. The cannons fell silent. The war was over. But for the people of the South, the suffering had only just begun. From Atlanta to Savannah to Columbia and beyond, a path of destruction cut straight through the heart of their world. Homes burned in the night, barns collapsed into ash, fields that once fed families for generations were stripped bare, railroads twisted into useless iron, livelihoods gone in a matter of hours. And for those who stood and watched it happen, this was not strategy. This was not theory. This was not politics. This was their lives, being taken from them. Women, children, the elderly, left to pick through smoking ruins, with no army to defend them, no way to fight back, no way to stop it. For many in the North, Sherman's march was brilliant, a campaign that broke the Confederacy's will and brought the war to an end. But in the South, it was remembered differently, not as victory, but as devastation brought to civilians. A war that no longer stayed on battlefields, but entered homes, crossed doorsteps, and consumed everything in its path. Even today, more than 150 years later, that memory has not faded. It lives in stories passed down through generations, stories of fire, of hunger, of loss, of families who lost everything and never recovered. Entire regions were left broken, an economy shattered, a people pushed into poverty for decades. and a question that still burns just as fiercely as the flames that once lit the southern sky. Was this justice or something else? When an army destroys not just soldiers, but the homes and survival of civilians, where is the line? When victory comes through devastation of an entire society, what does that make it? Military necessity? Or something we would call differently today? History has argued over Sherman's march for generations. Some call it the strategy that ended the war. Others call it the moment war changed forever, when civilians became part of the battlefield. But in the South, the verdict was never written in books. It was written in ashes, in empty fields, in broken families, in a memory that refused to die. Because long after the armies were gone, long after the flags were lowered, long after the war officially ended, the people who lived along that road never forgot what they saw, never forgot what they lost, and never stopped asking, was it worth it?